The stadium wasn't just loud, it was alive. 50,000 voices pulsed together in a rhythm so primal, it rattled the steel framework of the arena. The ground shook beneath thousands of stomping feet. Each thunderous beat a declaration that tonight wasn't just a concert. Tonight was a reckoning. Michael, Michael, Michael. The chant rolled like a war cry across the night air, swelling until it seemed to merge with the very atmosphere. It wasn't sound anymore, it was pressure, pressing into lungs and bones, demanding surrender. Fans waved glowing signs that flickered like stars. Flashbulbs popped in waves, and cell phones held high turned the vast arena into a galaxy. Every tiny light pointed toward one man who hadn't yet stepped into view. Backstage, just beyond the black curtain that quivered from the force of the crowd's roar, Michael Jackson stood utterly still. The sequin jacket he wore glittered as stage lights bled through the cracks of the curtain, fractured rainbows rippling across his chest. He flexed his gloved hand once, slowly, the rhinestones catching light like shattered glass. His breathing was shallow, controlled, every exhale a measured release of nerves and focus. For anyone else, a crowd like this would have been terrifying. For Michael, it was familiar. He had seen screaming masses before. He had commanded stadiums larger than some cities. But even for him, there was something different in the air tonight. Something electric. Something that felt less like anticipation and more like destiny. He tilted his head slightly, listening. The crowd's chant wasn't random chaos. It was structured, unified, pulsing like the heartbeat of a single organism. It was as if all 50,000 people had conspired, their voices braided into one undeniable force. And for the first time in years, Michael felt his own pulse quicken, not with nerves, but with a strange sense of foreboding. 30 seconds, whispered stagehand, headset pressed against his ear. He touched Michael lightly on the arm. Michael nodded once. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence, his presence, his stillness, even offstage, were commands all their own. Another voice crackled through the stage manager's headset. Lights down. Cue pyro in 3, 2. The arena plunged into black. The roar that followed was primal. 50,000 voices screaming into the void, as if sound alone could summon their idol. The sudden silence of instruments and lights turned every heartbeat into a drum, every breath into fire. Then, boom. Fire erupted along the stage's edge, a wall of flame slicing the darkness. Smoke coiled upward, illuminated in flashes of red and gold. The screens lit up with a stark silhouette. A lean figure, one arm raised, frozen in the unmistakable outline the world knew too well. The crowd erupted. Screams tore through the air so fiercely they bordered on hysteria. Some fans collapsed against the barricades, overcome. Others clutched their faces, sobbing before he'd even taken a step. Michael stepped forward, first one boot, then the other, heels striking the stage with deliberate precision. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Every movement, no matter how small, was a detonation of hysteria. The spotlight caught him fully now, his white shirt billowing beneath the sequin jacket, his fedora pulled low, his jawline set like stone. For a moment, he didn't sing. He didn't even move beyond that slow, careful walk. He simply stood there, letting the weight of 50,000 eyes crash into him like waves. He raised his head slightly, scanning the sea of faces. Thousands of signs lifted higher. Tears glistened on cheeks. Voices cracked under the strain of screaming his name. The band launched into the first heavy beat. Bass thundered, drums pounded, and the opening riff slashed through the night. Michael shifted his stance, knees bent slightly, body coiled like a spring ready to ignite. He snapped his head to the side in that sharp, electric motion that was his alone. The crowd shrieked as though the earth itself had cracked. But then, something unexpected. Just as he raised the microphone, the wall of sound hit him differently. This wasn't the usual roar of adoration, the familiar scream of fans who wanted more. This was layered, unified. It wasn't chaotic. It was patterned. Michael froze. The dancers behind him exchanged quick glances, unsure. The band, trained to follow his every move, didn't falter. They kept the groove alive, the bass line hammering through the floor. But Michael stood still, his gloved hand gripping the mic stand, his eyes locked somewhere out in the darkness of the crowd. The chant had shifted. It wasn't Michael anymore. It wasn't screams or shrieks. It was words. Words carried in unison, surging up from 50,000 throats, pounding into his chest with the force of 1,000 drums. He blinked, breath hitching. His heartbeat stumbled. The spotlight glared against his dampened eyes, catching the subtle shimmer of moisture that he couldn't hide fast enough. The music was still going, the dancers still frozen in their starting poses. The entire arena, the cameras, the screens, the world, focused entirely on the fact that Michael Jackson, master control, had stopped dead in his tracks. For the first time in years, he wasn't leading the crowd. The crowd was leading him. Michael's jaw tightened. His throat worked, but no sound came out. His gloved hand lowered the microphone just slightly, as though he were surrendering it to the roar rising around him. His chest rose sharply with a breath he hadn't meant to take so loudly. 50,000 voices rose higher, pressing harder, determined not to be ignored. And Michael Jackson, the king of pop, the most famous performer alive, stood frozen, in shock, as history began to write itself without him. If you are enjoying this story, please subscribe to support the channel. The music didn't stop. It couldn't, not yet. The band, drilled to keep the rhythm alive until Michael gave them a cue, thundered on with flawless precision. Drums cracked like gunfire. The bass line grooved low and heavy. The lead guitar sliced sharp across the night air. Every beat screamed for him to move, to spin, to let the spectacle explode into performance everyone had come to see. But Michael didn't move. He stood there, frozen in his own spotlight, his sequin jacket shimmering like starlight caught in a storm. His chest heaved, his gloved hand locked around the microphone stand, but his eyes, those wide, dark eyes, were staring beyond the front rows, past the barricades, straight into the heart of the sea of humanity pressing against the stage. Something was wrong. Or rather, something was different. The noise had changed. The sound wasn't chaos anymore. It wasn't scattered screams or high-pitched shrieks, the kind of adoration he could ride like a wave. This was something unified, a shape in the chaos, a voice built not from one throat, but from tens of thousands. 50,000 people weren't calling his name anymore. They were singing. Michael blinked, his breath catching sharp in his throat. The melody pouring back at him was one he knew better than his own heartbeat. It was his song. Every word, every note, fired back at him from 50,000 lungs with military precision. He lowered the microphone half an inch, his body trembling with the sudden realization. They didn't need him. The dancers shifted behind him, unsure whether to hold their frozen poses or move. Their leader wasn't leading. Sweat shone on foreheads that had nothing to do with the heat of the stage lights. Band members exchanged nervous glances. Was this a malfunction? Was he sick? Was something wrong with the monitors? But Michael wasn't thinking about choreography. He wasn't thinking about lights or pyrotechnics, or whether his next spin would land perfectly on the beat. His mind was drowning in the flood of voices that had risen to claim the night. Heal the world. Make it a better place. The words came like a wave, soft at first, then swelling until it became an anthem. Michael's throat tightened, so hard it burned. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He could only listen. His song, his prayer to humanity, written in quiet solitude years ago, was being sung back to him by 50,000 strangers, not as fans, not as spectators, but as believers. The lyrics carried a weight he hadn't expected, a plea woven into every syllable. This wasn't just a concert anymore. It was a communion. Michael staggered one step back. He didn't mean to. It was instinct, like his body had been struck. His hand gripped the mic stand tighter, knuckles flashing white beneath the rhinestones of his glove. He had been on countless stages, seen hysteria of unimaginable magnitude. But this was different. This wasn't hysteria. This was love made physical. The cameras caught everything. Zoom lenses framed his face, eyes shimmering wet under the harsh glare of the spotlight. The Jumbotron showed it to everyone in the stadium. Michael Jackson, undone. The unshakable performer, the man who could command the heartbeat of an arena with a single gesture, was now breathless and silent, overwhelmed by the very people he had come to entertain. The crowd didn't stop. They couldn't. Their voices grew louder, richer, filling every corner of the stadium, echoing back against the steel beams and concrete walls until it felt like the very earth was vibrating beneath their feet. People who had never met were suddenly harmonizing, tears streaming, arms linked with strangers, families pressed together, swaying. Teenagers screamed lyrics through sobs. Even the security guard along the barricades, men hired to be stoic, unshaken, mouthed the words, some wiping at their eyes when they thought no one could see. Michael's chest rose sharply. He pressed a trembling hand to his forehead, overwhelmed. For a fleeting second, he thought about turning away, about stepping off stage to collect himself. The weight of it all was almost unbearable. But then he looked again. He saw the front row, a young girl clutching her father's arm, tears streaming as she sang every word. A teenage boy, eyes closed, face tilted to the sky, his voice raw from shouting. A mother with a baby on her hip, bouncing gently, whispering the chorus into the child's tiny ear. And beyond them, 50,000 people, singing not for him but with him. Something inside Michael cracked. He tilted his head back, eyes glistening. He pulled the microphone up again, but not to sing. He held it outward, away from his lips, lowering it into the roar like an offering. The audience's voice was amplified to the speakers, turning the stadium into a single, unified choir. The band faltered. One by one, instruments dropped out. First the bass, then the keys, then the drums. Even the guitar fell silent, the final chord dying into the night. And still, the song continued, 50,000 strong, louder now that there was nothing competing with them. Michael lowered his arms slowly, his other hand pressed against his chest as though to hold his heart in place. His jaw trembled. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the performer. He was the witness. The world was watching. Cameras rolled, recording the moment in high definition. Millions at home, who would later see the broadcast, would talk about this instant for decades. The moment Michael Jackson, the man who had defined spectacle, choreography, and sound itself, was rendered speechless by the audience he thought he was there to lead. And yet, in that silence, in that surrender, something beautiful happened. The barrier between stage and seats vanished. The arena was no longer divided into performer and spectators. It was one body, one voice, one song. Michael closed his eyes. A single tear slipped free, tracing down his cheek, catching on the rhinestones of his glove when he brushed it away. He couldn't stop them anymore. The music had stopped. The show had paused. Time itself seemed suspended. And in the middle of it all, Michael Jackson stood frozen in shock, listening to 50,000 voices rise in unison, and realizing he wasn't just hearing his song. He was hearing his legacy. For a few suspended seconds, Michael Jackson forgot who he was supposed to be. Not the king of pop. Not the man who moonwalked into history. Not the untouchable icon bathed in lights, fireworks, and adoration. He was simply a man standing in front of 50,000 souls, his heart thundering against his ribs, his breath caught halfway between disbelief and awe. The sound washed over him, a tide he couldn't control. They were still singing his song, but it wasn't his anymore. It belonged to them now, woven into their voices. Each word a testament, each note an offering. Michael blinked rapidly, trying to steady his vision. Through the tears forming at the corners of his eyes, the crowd blurred into a sea of faces. And yet, certain ones cut through, sharp and unforgettable. A boy no older than 10, standing on his seat, fists raised as he shouted every lyric, his voice cracking but unwavering. A woman in her 40s, eyes closed, palms pressed together like she was praying, her lips trembling as the chorus spilled out of her. A group of young men with arms wrapped around each other's shoulders, swaying and chanting as though they had rehearsed for this moment their whole lives. And then, there, near the front barricade, a teenager holding up a cardboard sign scrawled in messy black marker, "You healed me, Michael." Michael's breath hitched. His gloved hand tightened around the microphone, but he still didn't raise it to his lips. That sign cut through the roar like a scalpel. "You healed me." He thought of all the lonely nights, the endless recording sessions, the public battles, the tabloid storms that threatened to swallow him whole. He thought of the times he had wondered if the music even mattered anymore, if people heard him or just saw him. And here, right in front of him, 50,000 people had answered without hesitation. He had been heard. Michael's knees bent slightly, his body folding inward, as though the sheer weight of the moment pressed down on him. He pressed one hand to his chest, over the spot where his heart pounded so fiercely it felt like it might break through his ribs. His lips trembled, the words caught there but refusing to leave. He wanted to speak, to say thank you, to tell them he loved them more than they could ever understand. But when he tried, his throat closed tight. All he could do was listen. There are people dying, if you care enough for the living. The words rolled like thunder, perfectly synchronized, 50,000 voices carrying the verse upward into the night sky. The sheer power of it made the stage vibrate beneath his boots. He had sung those lines 1,000 times, but never had they carried this kind of weight. It was no longer a lyric. It was a declaration. Michael's eyes lifted again, sweeping across the stadium. The floodlights painted waves of people, row after row after row, arms lifted, bodies swaying. Every soul locked into the same rhythm. His breath came out shaky, broken by the tears now streaming freely down his face. For years, he had been a perfectionist, the choreographer, the man who demanded every detail of every performance be flawless. But this was beyond perfection. This was chaos forged into harmony. This was love in its rawest form. The cameras caught his tears. They showed them on the jumbotrons towering above the stage, magnifying every shimmer wetness, every crack in his facade. And the crowd cheered louder at the sight, as though his humanity was the greatest gift he had ever given them. Michael tried again to lift the microphone to his lips. His hand shook violently. He lowered it again. He realized he couldn't interrupt them. To do so would be to shatter the fragile, beautiful thing happening right before him. So instead, he raised his arms. Slowly, deliberately, he extended both hands outward, palms open, as though to embrace them all. The crowd roared louder, their voices swelling higher. Some screamed. Most kept singing, tears streaming down their faces, as they realized Michael wasn't going to take the song back. He was giving it to them. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the center of the show. He was a witness. Michael turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at his band. Their instruments hung idle, hands hovering, waiting for his cue. But his eyes said everything. Don't play, let them sing. The band nodded in understanding. One by one, they lowered their instruments, stepping back into the shadows. The stage, usually filled with light and fire and spectacle, now belonged entirely to the people in the stands. Michael's chest heaved again. A sob slipped from his throat. Caught by the microphone, though, he hadn't meant to let it. The sound wasn't music, wasn't performance. It was real, unfiltered emotion, and somehow, impossibly, it only made the crowd sing louder. 50,000 voices. One song. And in that moment, Michael understood something he had never fully grasped, even after decades of fame. This wasn't about him. Not really. It was about what the music had done for them. The healing, the hope, the belief. The spotlight no longer felt like a crown. It felt like a mirror. Michael tilted his head back again, eyes closed, tears streaking down his cheeks. He let the sound pour over him, through him, into him. He was shaking now, trembling with the force of it. For a terrifying, beautiful second, he thought his body might give out completely. But he held on. The song swelled toward the chorus again. Michael opened his eyes, wet and shining, and looked out at the endless sea of humanity, giving his words back to him. He finally understood. He wasn't alone. He had never been alone. He raised a microphone, but not to sing over them, only to amplify them. He held it outward, letting their voices roar through the speakers, letting the world hear what 50,000 hearts united could sound like. And then it hit him. This was what he had always been searching for. Not the awards, not the headlines, not even the perfection of the stage. It was this, the connection, the proof that his music had mattered. Michael Jackson, frozen in shock, undone by love, stood in the middle of 50,000 voices and recognized his true legacy. Not the man on stage, but the world he had helped change with song. The song swelled to its peak. 50,000 voices chanting the chorus again, louder this time, the words soaring into the night air like a prayer wrapped in thunder. Michael stood in the center of it all, chest heaving, eyes glistening. He had always been conductor, the architect of every sound, every light, every breath of choreography. But now he wasn't in control. He had been stripped down, peeled away, left not as a king of pop, but as a man trembling under the weight of his own creation. The band had gone silent. The dancers remained frozen. Even the crew along the edges of the stage stood still, headsets forgotten, eyes glued to the sight of their leader undone. The only sound in the world was a crowd. 50,000 voices singing as one. Michael raised his microphone again. His hand shook violently, but he steadied it with his other hand. He pressed it close to his lips. His mouth opened, and nothing came out. The silence hit harder than any note. The crowd gasped. For a split second, 50,000 voices faltered, as though uncertain whether to keep going. But then, Michael did something none of them expected. He lowered the microphone, turned it outward, and extended both arms wide. It was a gesture of surrender, a silent command. It's yours now. The crowd roared in approval, and then, impossibly, they grew louder, louder than any stadium had ever sounded. The words weren't perfect. Not every voice was in tune, but together they were transcendent. The imperfections blended into something raw and holy, something no producer could ever replicate in a studio. Michael staggered back a step, overwhelmed by the tidal wave of sound. His knees bent slightly, his body trembling. For the first time in decades of performance, he was no longer performing. He was being carried. The spotlight shifted, widening to bathe the audience in light. On the screens above, the cameras showed the sea of humanity. Faces lifted, arms outstretched, tears flowing freely. It was no longer about the man in the sequin jacket. It was about the people who had made his music their own. Michael's throat clenched. A sob ripped free, unplanned, unhidden. The microphone caught it and sent it echoing across the arena, raw and broken. Instead of weakening the moment, it deepened it. The crowd screamed louder at the sound of his humanity breaking through. Michael. Voices cried between verses, but most kept singing, unwilling to let the magic stop. He turned in a slow circle, his eyes sweeping across the endless rows of faces. It felt like looking into eternity. Every corner of the stadium was alive, vibrating with sound, with love, with devotion. He pressed both hands to his chest, bowing slightly, tears dripping down his cheeks. Behind him, one of his dancers finally broke pose. She lowered her arms, her eyes wet, and whispered to another, "I've never seen him like this." The other dancer nodded silently. The crew backstage fumbled with cameras, realizing they were capturing history. Some wiped their own eyes as they filmed. Even hardened stagehands who had seen it all before felt their throats tighten. Michael slowly lifted one hand and pointed toward the sky. The cameras followed, showing the heavens above, a deep indigo canvas streaked with stars. It was as though he was acknowledging something beyond himself, beyond the show, beyond the fame. The crowd erupted again, their singing shifting into wordless cries, cheers, sobs, chants. The sound was deafening, and yet it was beautiful. Michael lowered to his knees. It was not rehearsed. It was not planned. It was instinct. A man bowing to his audience, to the music, to the moment itself. He placed the microphone gently on the stage floor, leaving it there like an offering. The speakers still caught the sound of 50,000 voices, amplified, unstoppable. The arena shook with applause and song. Fans in the upper levels stamped their feet. So hard the concrete vibrated. People clung to each other, unable to believe what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a concert anymore. It was something spiritual. Michael bent forward, pressing his forehead to his gloved hands as though in prayer. He stayed like that, motionless, for several long seconds. The cameras caught it, beaming the image onto giant screens. The world's greatest performer kneeling before his audience, overwhelmed by their love. When he finally rose, his face was wet with tears. The makeup had begun to run. His chest heaved with every breath. He was shaking, But there was a strange peace in his eyes now, the look of a man who had been broken open and remade in real time. He picked up the microphone again, his hand trembling. The crowd hushed slightly, waiting, hoping he might speak. For a long moment, only his breathing filled the speakers. Then, in a voice so soft it barely carried, he whispered, "Thank you." The two words rippled through the stadium, magnified by the speakers, swallowed by silence, and then answered by a roar so loud it nearly tore the roof off the building. 50,000 people screamed, cried, and chanted his name again, not as an idol, but as someone they had seen stripped bare. Michael nodded slowly, his lips trembling, his voice cracking as he tried to continue. I love you more." The crowd answered with another roar, but Michael shook his head, holding up a trembling hand. He pressed a microphone against his chest, as if pinning their voices to his heart. The band watched him carefully. Normally, this was when he would call them back in, demand the rhythm, the beat, the precision. But not tonight. Tonight, the silence, filled only by the quiet of the crowd, was louder than any drum, more powerful than any riff. Michael tilted his head back, closed his eyes, and let the audience finish the song without him. It was no longer his to sing. The final notes of the song didn't come from the stage. They came from the crowd. 50,000 voices carried the last chorus, rising into the open night sky like an anthem meant for the heavens themselves. When the final line faded into silence, the stadium seemed to hold its breath, unwilling to let go of the magic it had conjured. Michael Jackson stood motionless at center stage, his chest heaving, the microphone pressed against his heart. He couldn't speak. He couldn't sing. His throat was raw with tears, his body trembling with the aftershocks of what had just happened. And then the eruption. The audience screamed, roared, sobbed. It wasn't the usual hysterical frenzy of a Michael Jackson concert. This was something deeper. People embraced strangers. Parents lifted their children into the air. Teenagers collapsed into each other's arms, overwhelmed by the weight of what they had just been part of. Even the most stoic security guards were wiping at their eyes. Michael finally managed to lift the microphone to his lips. His voice cracked, fragile, almost childlike. He stopped, swallowing hard. "You don't know what this means to me." The crowd screamed louder, but then quieted, straining to hear him. His words were trembling, uneven, but they carried. "All my life," he whispered, "I dreamed of this. Not the lights, not the fame, but this. You, singing back to me, loving me, showing me that it mattered." The arena was silent, except for the muffled sobs of thousands. He closed his eyes, shaking his head slowly, as though still unable to believe it. "I love you more." The words were simple, but they detonated across the stadium. The crowd erupted again, their roar rolling like thunder. Chants of Michael, Michael, surged, but now they carried a different tone. It wasn't the hungry call of fans begging for more spectacle. It was gratitude. It was communion. Michael bowed low, folding at the waist, his free hand pressed to his chest. The cameras captured every second, magnifying the sight of the world's greatest performer humbled to tears. He stayed bent for so long that some in the audience thought he might not rise again. When he finally straightened, his shoulders were trembling, his eyes red and wet, but shining with a light that seemed almost unearthly. Behind him, the band waited for a cue that never came. Normally, this would have been a point where the music roared back to life, where Michael reclaimed the stage with a dazzling dance break or a hit single. But not tonight. Tonight, the silence was a show. He lifted the microphone one last time, his voice soft but steady. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone formal now, almost reverent, "you've given me the greatest gift of my life tonight. You reminded me why I do this. Not for the fame, not for the cameras. For you, for the love." The audience cheered, a tidal wave of sound. Some sobbed openly. Others clutched their hearts. All of them knew they were part of something they would never see again. Michael turned slowly, gazing at every corner of the stadium as if trying to memorize every face. His hand trembled as he pointed outward, sweeping across the crowd. "Don't ever forget," he whispered, "that you are the music." The words hit like a lightning strike. The arena exploded in applause, a sound so loud it drowned out even the fireworks that erupted seconds later. streaking across the sky in a cascade of silver and gold. Michael didn't dance. He didn't sing another note. He simply stood there, tears streaking his cheeks, arms wide as the crowd roared their devotion back at him. It was the most un-Michael Jackson thing he had ever done. And because of that, it became the most unforgettable. When he finally walked off stage, flanked by trembling dancers and stunned band members, the chants didn't stop. They followed him into the tunnels, echoing through concrete, vibrating into his bones. Michael, Michael, Michael. Backstage, his crew swarmed, unsure whether to speak. His road manager reached out, hesitant. Michael, are you all right? Michael pressed a hand to his chest, his eyes still wet, his voice hoarse. I've never been better. That night became legend. Bootleg recordings surfaced within days, passed hand to hand, treasured not for perfection of performance, but for the humanity of it. Fans replayed the grainy videos over and over, not to hear Michael, but to hear themselves, the 50,000 voices that had stunned the king of pop into silence. News outlets replayed the footage worldwide. Headlines screamed, Michael Jackson brought to tears by fans. 50,000 voices stopped the king of pop in his tracks. The night the audience became the show. Commentators called it the most extraordinary moment in live music history. Critics who had dismissed him as spectacle over substance were silenced. For once, nobody talked about controversy or scandal or even choreography. They talked about love. They talked about connection. They talked about the night Michael Jackson froze in shock and let his audience carry him. For years afterward, fans who had been there told their stories like pilgrims describing a sacred vision. I was there, they would say, tears in their eyes. I sang that night. I saw Michael cry. And those who hadn't been there would listen in awe, wishing they had. Michael himself never forgot it. In interviews, he would smile softly when asked about it, his voice quiet, reverent. That night, he once said, I learned that sometimes the greatest performance is letting go. The footage lived on. Younger generations watched it and understood something their parents had tried to explain. That Michael Jackson wasn't just a performer. He was a vessel, and in that moment, he had handed the vessel back to the people. The stadium where it happened eventually installed a plaque near the main entrance. It read, Here, on this stage, 50,000 voices rose as one and reminded the world what music is truly for. In honor of Michael Jackson and the fans who showed him that love is louder than fame. Even decades later, fans would touch the plaque before entering, some whispering the lyrics of the song, some simply standing in silence, remembering. Michael Jackson gave the world countless unforgettable performances, but none of them, not the moonwalk, not the Super Bowl, not the Grammys, ever carried the same weight as the night he froze in shock and surrendered his fans. Because on that night, 50,000 strangers became a single voice, and that voice was so powerful, it stopped the king of pop himself in his tracks. If you like this story, please subscribe to support this channel.